2 Corinthians chapter 4 reminds me of a popular 90s praise and worship song by Daryl Evans entitled Trading My Sorrows. So I want to invite you to listen to these lyrics for just a moment, and then we'll talk about them in light of this passage that inspired them. It goes something like this. There's one more part. The bridge goes like this. I'm oppressed but not crushed, persecuted, not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed. I'm blessed beyond the curse, for the promise will endure. His joy is gonna be my strength. Though the sorrows may last for the night, His joy comes with the morning. Don't get me wrong, I enjoy this song very much. I've sung it many times, but there's already a problem here, and that problem is I and my. I'm trading my. And this passage that this song is derived from, 2 Corinthians chapter 4, is actually centered on community. And I'll show you what I mean. So let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning in verse 6, which reads, "For God, who said, 'Let light shine out of darkness,' made God's light shine in our hearts to give us the light of the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. But we have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that this all-surpassing power is from God and not from us." So already we read here that God's light is deposited into human vessels, or jars of clay, and is to shine in the midst of darkness. Light dispels darkness, so whatever darkness is surrounding us, it is our job to shine God's light in the midst of it. That means the church absolutely must be relevant to the present darkness of viral disease and the systemic racial disease plaguing this country and our world. Furthermore, there are no stipulations on what kind of earthen vessels or jars of clay contain God's light. In fact, if you look at Acts 2, when Peter quotes the prophet Joel in his inaugural sermon of the church, he says, quote, "In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people." So all people are treasure carriers, or jars of clay containing this great treasure. And all people are light bearers. 2 Corinthians 4 continues in verse 8, which reads, "We are hard-pressed on every side, but not crushed, perplexed, but not in despair, persecuted, but not abandoned, struck down, but not destroyed." Now, it is noteworthy that Paul knew a great deal about literal crushing, despair, and persecution. He was literally whipped. He was literally beaten. He was literally stoned and literally shipwrecked. He knew quite a bit about persecution. Now, many of us know about what I might refer to as tribulations light. For example, my own crushing perhaps might be that I have student loan debt that I have to take care of. But I'm not experiencing anything like Paul experienced. Poverty in the U.S. often looks like affluence in the developing world. This is what cultural anthropologists call relative poverty. So there are different levels of struggle, different levels of suffering, different levels of difficulty. Now, there are those in our society who are experiencing serious crushing and literal persecution that is often far more difficult than what we may be facing. For example, in an extensive ethnographic work entitled Inheriting the City, a young Dominican man in New York was asked to define success for someone of his ethnicity and race. He replied, quote, "Being able to say that you're alive." He considered a Dominican man in his mid-20s living in New York to be successful simply by being alive. My point is, this passage centers on we, and that means there should be solidarity in crushing, persecution, and all manner of suffering. We must stand with those experiencing persecution that often far surpasses our own. In fact, read on in verses 10 and 11. It says, "We always carry around in our body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. For we who are alive are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that his life may also be revealed in our mortal body." So the suffering of Jesus here, who suffered on behalf of others, is to be materialized or incarnated, if you like, in our body. That is compassion, which in the Latin means to suffer with. Now, I take this usage of our body in this verse to indicate both our personal bodily action and the action of our collective church body. So, in my view, here is the takeaway from this portion of this passage. God's light is in the hearts of the community. We have this treasure in every variation of clay jars, no matter what the jars look like. We must be relevant to the present darkness in this world. We are hard-pressed to varying degrees, so we should shoulder the crushing and persecution of others together in solidary community. So, rather than trading my sorrow and my pain, let's trade our sorrow and our pain, because everyone cannot experience the joy of the Lord until we stand in solidarity with all members of the human community who are struck down, who are persecuted, who are crushed and abandoned by our society.